recording this. Okay, so hi everybody again, and welcome. I'm glad you could join us tonight on behalf of Neurodiversity Belgium for this session, Neurodivergence in the Body, Health Conditions and Their Mechanisms. We're really excited to have Scotti McLaren here with us this evening. Scotti's a functional medicine practitioner and registered nutritionist therapist based in Geneva, but works online, of course, everywhere. And she specializes in brain and hormonal health, and especially in the context of neurodivergence. Scotti's background combines science and lived experience in such a meaningful way. She's got a master's in psychology, neuroscience of mental health at King's College in London, a degree in nutritional science from Middlesex University, and she's deeply curious about how our bodies and brains connect, especially when it comes to things like burnout, which we're all familiar about, ADHD, autism, and hormonal changes. Scotti's approach is very down to earth. She looks at what's going on in the system, cellular level, but always ties that back to real life and how we actually feel. Tonight, she's going to be helping us make sense of why things like MCAS, POTS, mitochondrial issues, adrenal fatigue, hormonal shifts, and often show up in neurodivergent people, and what might really be going on underneath. So expect, hopefully, a lot of practical insights. There's a lot she's cramming in there, so we might have to follow up with lots of questions. And probably a few connections that you didn't even know were there, which is why we really wanted to have Scotti here today, because many of us have lots of physical issues that come with the package of being neurodivergent. So I'm not going to talk too much longer. A few housekeeping bits before we get stuck in. The session's being recorded, as I mentioned, and we'll share that replay afterwards with everyone who is registered. Feel free to add any questions or reflections in the chat as we go along. That will be helpful at the end, because we'll collect a few of those questions, and we'll have some time for Q&A. And last time Scotti was very generous. We had to actually turn her off. But not because all of us wanted to go home, but a few people did. But usually very open to extending that if needed. And if you need to step away, it's totally fine. You can always catch up later with recording, of course. Move around, we're all neurodivergent. And just a gentle reminder to keep the chat space a bit kind and respectful. Sometimes these topics can be a bit personal. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Scotti. And yeah, welcome, Scotti. Thanks for being
here. Thank you very much. Yeah, so I'm really happy to be here talking about one of my favorite subjects, which is physical mental health, and to be speaking with a group of my people, so being neurodivergent. One thing, yes, time management is not my forte, but I will need to go at 8:30 Central European time. So I will try and not speak too much to leave enough time for a good, thorough Q&A. Whatever questions we don't manage to get through, you can always put them in the chat, and I will follow up by email. And also, I can't remember, I didn't notice if Yvette mentioned this, but we will stop the recording for the Q&A. So what's said there stays there. And, you know, I was really interested in this specific topic. In fact, let's just, yeah, this is what we're going to talk about. EDS, which comprises a lot of hypermobility. POTS, well, it's a lot of acronyms. We'll come to them. POTS, MCAS, lovingly known as the trifecta. And then dysfunctions, mitochondria, adrenals, HPA, again, more acronyms, we'll come to those, and hormonal dysregulations. And a few reasons why I wanted to talk about these things is one, I'm seeing them a lot in my clients. Yeah, well, especially MCAS. I'm seeing really a lot of histamine uh, issues. And so I really wanted to do a deep dive into hypermobility and POTS and all that goes along with it. And the point here is really that these three conditions, there's a huge overlap. And I wanted to bring into it these three dysfunctions because they're really common in neurodivergence. So all of this is common in neurodivergent folks. And a big key message to make is that it's all connected, right? It sounds cliche, and yet it's what I see with my clients time and time again. There's no one thing with one driver. Everything affects everything else in the body and the brain. So, yeah, I wanted to look at this. The one glaring dysfunction that's missing from here, which probably you're sitting at home going, yeah, but what about digestive health? And I purposely skipped that one, if only because it's its own separate can of worms. And secondly, that there's already a lot of information out there. So happy to talk more about digestive issues. It will come up when we talk about these issues. But yeah, I just wanted to focus on maybe some lesser known issues. So, and also just to say, this is going to be a really informal talk because I'm a really informal girl, and it's a Sunday evening, and yeah, and that's just it. So hope that's okay for everyone. Um, okay. So just some key statistics. First of all, the prevalence in each of these. Now, prevalence is a tricky one because, of course, it depends how it's being measured, and we will see that all of these are underdiagnosed. But the general thinking is that 1 in 500 have EDS, 1 in 100 have POTS, 1 in 10 have MCAS. But then as it comes to neurodivergence, the neurodivergent folks, we see we see hypermobility in 20 to 30% of us. We see POTS symptoms in 20 to 25%, and high histamine in 40 to 60%. Okay, so there's something going on here. There's a clear link, right? In all of these, it's leaning in favor of the women. We tend to experience these more than the men. And for, let's say, hypermobility, symptoms start to emerge teens, early 20s. In POTS, it's also, diagnosis is also starting in the teens, but can go as high as 35 on average. And MCAS has a little bit of a later onset. So following a big trigger, and we're going to look at all of these. Okay, so the first one, first we're going to talk about, I've never said this out loud, Ehlers-Danlos Syndrome. Please forgive me if I'm massacring the pronunciation. So this is actually not one condition, but it's a collection of 14 different types of issues. And what they all have in common is connective tissue. It's connective tissue disorder, connective tissue disorders. And connective tissue is really the glue that's holding the body together. And this syndrome then happens where there are DNA defects in the way that we're making this connective tissue. So for 13 of the 14, there's a clear genetic, well, they're all genetically driven. They're heritable, so they're inherited. And for 13 of the 14 conditions, we know the genetic markers that drive it. Unfortunately, hypermobility is really comprises 90% of EDS.
Yeah, post it webinar.
And
Remove from the slide. Sorry.
okay, can we all put ourselves on mute, please? I don't want to dominate, but just to make sure that we're not disrupting others. So for those 13, which we know the marker, we can test for it by blood. But hypermobility comprises 90% of the people with EDS. And for that one, we don't know the marker. So harder to diagnose, but not difficult to see hypermobility. And I think this image is a really good and common feature among neurodivergent folks. Okay, so about EDS. Yeah, actually, I've already spoken about a lot of these points. So it's all about connective tissue. So this faulty collagen is going to lead to fragility in the joints, the blood vessels, the skin, the internal organs. So it's not so easy to see. It's not so easy to diagnose because it's affecting lots of different parts in the body. Yeah, and connective tissue, it's important because it's present in every cell of the body. So what that means is that, and we're going to see this with all of the conditions we talk about today, is that it influences multiple systems in the body. So, okay, this is how it shows up in the body. Looking at, because it's in every cell of the body, it's affecting lots and lots of different systems. So musculoskeletal, joint pain, dislocations, muscle fatigues. But then in cardiovascular system, because the vessels are fragile, we can have easy bruising, dizziness, palpitations. In the digestive system, it's going to slow down motility. It can cause bloating, dysbiosis, reflux. And by the way, I'm going to give you a little precursor just to say you're going to recognize these points a lot of the same kind of points as we talk about the other conditions. In the nervous system, there could be headaches, anxiety, proprioceptive issues, so not knowing where we are in space. Skin and connective tissue, yes. Soft, stretchy, fragile skin, and slow wound healing. So lots of different symptoms. It's, hypermobility is probably the most common one. But it shows up in lots of other ways. So what can make us more vulnerable to, I'm just going to call it hypermobility, since that comprises 90%. But having the genetic variant, that's going to be the number one risk factor. Hormonal fluctuations, again, a common theme. Dysregulation of the autonomic immune systems. Trauma, chronic inflammation, and key nutrient deficiencies, which are linked with this, which are linked really with connective tissue, vitamin C, copper, zinc. Then how do we know if we have hypermobility? So there's genetic testing for those 13 subtypes for which we know the marker, but not for hypermobility. There is what's called the Beighton score, which is looking at the mobility of 5 different joints. However, it's very possible that your joints aren't, the joints that are really affected aren't included in those 5 joints. So it can be missed for that. But there is a self-reported screening tool called Hakim and Graham. It's a 5-point questionnaire. And those 5 points, if you, the 5 points are, if you can put your hands flat on the floor without bending your knees, If you can move your thumb to touch your forearm, if you could do the splits or contortion acts as a party trick as a child, if you've had recurrent shoulder or kneecap dislocations, or if you're self-described as double jointed. So according to this screening tool, you only need to answer yes to 2 of these 5 points to be considered as generalized joint hypermobility. That was interesting for me because I never considered myself hypermobile, and yet I do meet 2 of the criteria. So by definition, I would be. And again, the fact that it affects so many different systems really complicates diagnosis and thus leads to underdiagnosis. And how does this relate to neurodivergence then? Well, connective tissue, these differences can affect our sensory systems. So again, proprioception, where are we in space? Our balance, our digestion, our perception of pain. You know, many neurodivergent people describe feeling uncoordinated or disconnected from their body, and EDS or hypermobility can amplify that through an unstable proprioception. And pain and muscle tension from hypermobility can then exacerbate the sensory overload, also exhaustion, executive function. So there's a lot of chronic pain, fatigue, and all of these, because they're so multisystemic, it often appears as anxiety, right? Or low motivation. And I think being neurodivergent, it's not our first rodeo with those. Okay, what can we do to support connective tissue? So this is looking at food, what kind of nutrients or sometimes supplements, and lab testing. So for food, we want to take care of the tissue. Again, the tissue. If we think about joints, bone broth, slow cooked meat, fish, and especially sardines because of the bones in them. Citrus fruit, colorful veg. Yeah, because these nutrients are needed for collagen synthesis. So having protein with every meal, this helps maintain muscle tone, joint stability, and reducing systemic inflammation. So this helps with tissue repair, pain regulation, and energy balance. And then the nutrients. Vitamin C helps with collagen formation and tissue repair. Zinc and copper are connective tissue cross-linking. Yeah, the only thing is with zinc and copper, just a word of caution. If you supplement one, you can deplete the other. So it's always good to take a pause. A lot of people supplement zinc, and if you do that, you just run the risk of depleting copper. So good idea to test both. Magnesium glycinate, it eases muscle tension, supports energy. Collagen peptides or gelatin, this helps with tissue resilience and recovery. So there are different types of collagen. Type 1 gives connective tissue its strength, and type 3 gives it its flexibility. Then omega-3 is an anti-inflammatory, and the B vitamins are for mitochondrial energy and repair processes. Okay, then lab testing. So through blood, it's a good idea to look at serum iron and ferritin. Also zinc, copper, vitamin C. These are all cofactors for producing collagen. Vitamin D supports bone and immune health. HSCRP stands for a highly sensitive C-reactive protein. This helps to monitor low-grade systemic inflammation. Then doing a hormone panel, which includes estrogen, progesterone, cortisol, DHEA. These are hormones which influence tissue elasticity and fatigue.
You want to close the
And then around methylation, Methylation is one of my favorite subjects. I have a lot of favorite subjects, but um, it's involved in detoxification, also DNA replication, brain health. And for that, it's a good idea to test B6, folate, homocysteine, B12, and holo-TC is the active form of B12. And methylation is also specifically really involved in connective tissue repair, energy metabolism. Okay, on to our second of our trifecta. So postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. All right. So about POTS. And this, I was really happy again to do the research for this presentation because I didn't know much about POTS before, and it's super interesting. So it's a disorder of the autonomic nervous system, of how that's regulated. And the autonomic nervous system being comprised of the sympathetic, which is our fight or flight system, our parasympathetic, which is the rest and digest system. So you're in one or the other, but also the enteric nervous system, and that's which lives in our gut, right? And that's what drives, or the three of these really are the gut-brain axis, but the enteric nervous system being the nervous system in our gut, in our digestive tract. And these are all then autonomic nervous system, meaning that they're outside of our conscious control. They just happen. So as these nervous systems are dysregulated, what happens is, yeah, I don't have it on this slide, but it is characterized by a heart rate increase of more than 30 beats per minute within 10 minutes of standing and without low blood pressure. So what that means is, the way they look at this is, when you're lying, when you stand up, gravity is going to pull the blood to your legs, meaning not enough blood is getting to your brain. And blood pressure is designed to help move that blood up to our brain. But with this dysregulation, that's not happening. And so the heart rate increases trying to get that blood up to the brain. So that's why it's measured by an increase in heart rate of over 30 beats per minute, and within 10 minutes of standing. So people who are experiencing symptoms of POTS, when they stand up, their heart rate jumps up and they can get dizzy, lightheaded, and then other symptoms exacerbated, which we will look at. So then there are three subtypes, one affecting vasoconstriction, meaning the blood vessels become constricted, become tight. There can be too much noradrenaline release, so noradrenaline being a neuromodulator, so a brain chemical. And noradrenaline is largely affected or is largely influencing cognitive abilities. So I'm sure there are a lot of connections being made here with neurodivergence. And then the third subtype is relating to low blood volume. Okay, this is how it's showing up in our body, because it's not only about the heart rate, but first cardiovascular system. So heart rate, palpitations, dizziness, especially when you stand up, can be fainting, can be low blood pressure and sweating. And again, I was really happy to do this research because these are symptoms that I see in my clients that I hadn't connected back to these conditions and to neurodivergence. So in the nervous system, so the autonomic system, again, it's a dysregulation of the autonomic system. So this can affect our ability to regulate temperature, shows up as anxiety-like symptoms, can be tremor. In the endocrine or hormonal system, also adrenals, there's dysregulation in cortisol, adrenaline, so surges, fatigue, bladder control, sexual arousal, then digestion can show up nausea, bloating, slow motility, or constipation. In the musculoskeletal system, there can be weakness, postural fatigue, and in the brain, so brain fog, inattention, light sensitivity. I'm sure you're all at home ticking a lot of boxes. Now, what are the risk factors that leave us vulnerable? So having EDS or hypermobility, having low blood volume, or venous pooling, hormonal fluctuations, right? Having an autoimmune or a viral trigger, right? So post-viral onset. Prolonged inactivity, chronic stress, HPA strain. So again, this is just one big web, and we are going to be revisiting all of these factors are going to fit in with all of these conditions. So how it's diagnosed clinically. First of all, again, the definition, heart rate increase over 30 beats per minute within 10 minutes of standing. No significant blood pressure drop while that happens. And confirmation is by a tilt table or active standing test. So the way they do this is patient is strapped to a motorized table. It tilts upright while the heart rate and blood pressure are monitored for abnormal increases when they stand. Then the active stand test. This is simpler. You can do it at home. Heart rate and blood pressure are measured lying down. Then, then you stand up and you measure it 2 minutes later, 5 minutes later, 10 minutes later after standing. So the challenges of diagnosis are really that it's once again, often my misdiagnosed as anxiety. It can be a moving target because it fluctuates daily. Our heart rate, our blood pressure fluctuate. So the time of day that it's measured matters. A lot of clinicians aren't familiar with the diagnostic criteria, and there can be limited access to formal tilt testing. So all of these lead to underdiagnosis. Now, how does it relate to neurodivergence? I'm sure we've all been ticking those boxes, but the autonomic dysregulation, first of all, so this can exacerbate sensory overload, anxiety-like symptoms, and fatigue. The lack of blood flow reaching the brain can slow down our focus and can overlap with ADHD symptoms, shutdown sensations. So being neurodivergent, many of us report this dysautonomia, which is essentially sensitivity to light, to heat, to postural changes. That there's a big overlap, that this overlap is likely linked to the shared connective tissue nervous system differences. So a lot of overlap. Now, what do we do to help support our autonomic nervous system? Protein, fats, healthy fats, salt, these help to maintain blood volume and energy. Being well hydrated with electrolytes or mineral salts, and being well hydrated means at least 2.5, 3 liters of water per day. Large carb heavy meals are going to lower blood pressure after, because it quickly converts to blood glucose, and glucose is going to spike and crash, right? So that's going to lower our blood pressure after. Then lifestyle would be compression garments, so for the legs, abdomen to reduce pooling. Horizontal exercise activities, so this would be swimming, rowing, Pilates, etc. Slow postural transitions, so from sitting to standing, and prioritizing sleep, stress management. Then for nutrients, electrolytes, this is going to support circulation. Vitamin B12 and folate improve nerve and red blood cell function. CoQ10, L-carnitine support mitochondrial energy. Magnesium glycinate, it's going to calm the sympathetic activity or that stress response. Omega-3 is anti-inflammatory, helps with vascular support. Then lab testing would be, in fact, I think all of these are by blood. So full blood count, yeah, full iron panel, and I've put all 5 markers. Very often, if you do a standard blood test, they're only going to look at ferritin, which is the storage, but it gives one piece of the picture. Thyroid panel, same. Usually a lab test is going to look at TSH, but I've put the other 2 markers to really help get the full picture. And by this, I mean, you want to request, if you're getting your thyroid tested, you want to request these extra markers. And then you hope that your doctor is nice enough that they'll do it. B12 folate, CoQ10, L-carnitine, looking at cortisol, DHEA. Cortisol, we're going to talk about more later on, but actually cortisol is best tested by saliva. And then again, HSCRP for inflammation. Okay, this brings us to Mast Cell Activation Syndrome. And I will say that I see this a lot in my clients. So what is it? It's immune dysregulation. So mast cells are a white blood cell. It's our first line of defense against threats from the outside world. And this dysregulation means that the mast cells get activated inappropriately. And these mast cells become hypersensitive, overly reactive to whatever the body recognizes as a threat. So literally by activation, what it means is that it degranulates, it bursts open. And as it bursts open, it releases thousands of chemical mediators, and in particular, histamine and inflammatory markers. So histamine, many of you have already made the connection between histamine and allergy symptoms, right? So you are not wrong. And we have mast cells everywhere in the body, but especially where there's contact with the outside world. So especially in the eyes, the nose, the airways. So again, think allergy symptoms, but also the GI tract. Yeah, we ingest food that goes into the GI tract, goes into the bladder, and then of course our skin. And mast cells are also particularly present in blood vessels, in nerves, in the lymph. So it's going to affect the vascular system, nervous system. So again, mast cells are really the defenders, right? Their whole MO is to fight against threats. So the overlap then with MCAS and POTS is that the nervous system and the immune system, they really work together. So the nervous system recognizes threats through our brain, through our mind. And the immune system is supposed to protect us from the outside world. So these 2 things are working together. So what happens is that mast cells, they detect a threat and they're screaming, something's wrong, right? It tells the nervous system, And the sympathetic nervous system is designed to, it's the fight or flight. So it's going to either fight or flee against those threats. So that is one explanation for such an overlap between MCAS and POTS. So whatever is considered a threat by the brain or by the body is really anything affecting. In fact, I put here the body's homeostasis being the balance of systems, but actually I would say also the mental homeostasis. So yeah, anything that's physical, emotional, cognitive, sensory, and by sensory, think lights, sounds, smells. The thing is that these all can vary by the time of day, by the mood, based on how much exposure, how much stress are we under. So stress is going to make all of this worse. Allergens, they are by definition a threat, right? So when we think of, seasonal allergies or dust or, pet dander, a trigger can also come from food. Food's high in histamine. We will speak a bit more about that. Nutritional deficiencies can be seen as a threat. Toxins and high estrogen. We're also going to speak more about that. But just going back to those sensory issues, I think especially with autism, these are really common, but also with ADHD and overwhelm. But so MCAS and neurodivergence, it's a common combination, but it's also a bad one because basically it means that we become allergic to everything in the world that stresses us. Okay. Histamine and estrogen, it's a bit of a love story, right? Because, and this is what I see in my clients a lot, they'll either have high histamine or high estrogen, and based on that, I can already guarantee that they're going to have the other, and both cause a lot of problems throughout the body. So with high estrogen, the body sees this as a threat, and the thing is, estrogen receptors, there are estrogen receptors on mast cells. So those get activated whenever there's a threat. So that's going to be hormonal triggers, menstruation, ovulation, whenever estrogen is high, right? Estrogen dominance, meaning when estrogen is present in the body more than progesterone, when it's not the right balance between these two. Also perimenopause with fluctuations, all of that is going to trigger histamine. And when histamine's high, high estrogen increases histamine. And also I would say histamine then also drives estrogen. Bit of a love story between these two. Interestingly, high testosterone lowers histamine. But I just put a word of caution here. Don't go out and try and supplement testosterone because hyperandrogenism can show up in things like polycystic ovarian syndrome. But so MCAS then is often misdiagnosed as psychiatric conditions, again, PMS, PMDD, endometriosis, and we'll see why. So it appears in a lot of bodily systems. That's why we have 2 slides for this. In the skin, think allergy symptoms, flushed skin, hives, itching, swelling, acne, bruising. In the cardiovascular system, it's the same symptoms as POTS, but also histamine can increase POTS. Then in the lymph can be swollen glands, lymphedema, inflammation, because again, immune system, right? So inflammation is part of the immune system. So the symptoms of inflammation would be fatigue, fever, weight change, temperature intolerance, neuroinflammation, and remembering that neuroinflammation is going to drive all of our it's a major contributor to all of our mental health challenges, let's say. and also inflammation being at the root of all chronic disease. Then neurological, yeah, headaches, brain fog, inattention, overactive stress response, or anxiety. I hope you all are hearing the commonalities. In the digestive tract, yeah, lots of symptoms, but in particular, food allergies, food intolerances, food sensitivities, right? Genitourinary and also endocrine systems, yeah, heavy periods, painful sex, pelvic pain, bladder issues. Again, this is really the link between estrogen and histamine, their love story. And then musculoskeletal, there's pain in the muscles and the joints. And the thing with this is that chronic stress and inflammation, the two together, this is common in neurodivergence, and it leaves the person really primed for pain, right? They're predisposed to it. And this is one way that I see it in my clients is they'll have body pain, joint pain, but it moves, right? And it's often linked with their hormonal cycles. So that's, again, the love story between histamine and estrogen. Estrogen jumps, histamine jumps, and it shows up as joint pain, and it moves. So, okay, risk factors would be, again, genetic predisposition, connective tissue disorders, chronic stress, inflammation, chronic infections or toxins, which are activating the immune system, gut issues, and hormonal factors. So high estrogen and or low progesterone. Oops. Then how is it diagnosed? These are the blood markers or urine markers, tryptase, prostaglandin D2, leukotriene E4. These are inflammatory markers. It is noted as being controversial because these markers are not seen as very reliable. But then another real indicator would be response to treatment. So if you're taking antihistamines or mast cell stabilizers, then that supports the diagnosis. It's commonly misdiagnosed as just allergies. I see that a lot. IBS or gut issues, skin issues, anxiety, psychiatric conditions, PMS, PMDD, endometriosis. Then what does it have to do with neurodivergent folk? Well, histamine affects our neurotransmission. So that's going to drive our attention, our mood, our sleep. And there is a common overlap among us because of immune system and nervous system crosstalk. The sensory sensitivities and stress triggers, these trigger mast cell release. So again, more histamine, more inflammation. And chronic histamine then increases the sensory and the emotional sensitivity. So it's bidirectional. Okay, finally, what do we do to ease histamine? We could spend a lot of time talking about this, but in short, food, as it relates to foods can be high in histamine. They can be histamine releasing, or they can block the DAO enzyme, which is the enzyme that breaks up histamine. So what we can do to reduce those triggers would be a low histamine diet. Yeah. So fresh, unprocessed foods are best. And what you want to avoid would be alcohol, fermented foods, aged cheese, leftovers. And if you think about histamine, it's a little bit like a bacteria. So the longer it sits around, it grows, right? That's why leftovers, that's why fermented foods, alcohol, fish can be a really common one. And what's important about histamine is it's a bucket. You don't need to avoid You know, a lot of my clients come to me with a list of histamine foods and they say, oh, but I can't eat any of this. And they end up with an eating disorder. I'm exaggerating, but yeah, it's not, we don't need to avoid all foods that have histamine, but what we want to do is not overfill our histamine bucket. So, you know, if you put in foods that are high in histamine, foods that that release histamine, foods that block DAO, and you put in the main culprits, the bucket's going to overflow, and that's when we get symptoms. So then, nutrients that can support histamine, vitamin C, quercetin. Quercetin is really a great one for histamine. DAO enzyme, it's actually, again, that's the enzyme that breaks down histamine. It is available in supplementation. Once again, magnesium glycinate, B6, omega-3 because it's anti-inflammatory. And I'll just mention here about nutrients, about supplements. Not everybody needs all of these, right? And it is really important to check contraindications against medications, but also if it depends what your drivers are. So if you have high histamine, these may or may not help you. It depends on all the other factors because as we've already seen, everything is connected. So with histamine, we want to support liver detoxification because we want to get it out. As part of that, we want to support methylation. That is a part of liver detoxification, namely linked with estrogen, but not only. And then digestive health. And here we have blood markers that can help to identify histamine. Estrogen and progesterone, I'll say they're not well tested by blood. They're better tested by urine. And a functional stool test just means a really detailed stool test that's not usually available from your doctor. It's available from a functional medicine practitioner. Okay. All right, that is the first half. Now, maybe everybody can stand up and stretch because that's a long time to be sitting and listening. This last part I'm going to blaze through because, again, I want to leave plenty of time for Q&A. But again, I wanted to touch on them just because they're common among neurodivergent folk, and two, that it's ways in which all of this is linked, and how neurodivergence shows up in the body, right? So I really would love to plead the case that, you know, we talk about neurodivergence as being mental health, but I would argue that it's as much about physical health as it is mental. So very common dysregulations among us would be hormonal dysregulation, HPA axis, that's the stress. That's you have the nervous system on one side, that's the fast stress response. The HPA axis, that's cortisol, that's the slower stress response. And then mitochondria is the part of the cell that produces energy. So the thing is, dysregulation among these systems can really shape how we think, how we feel, how we recover. So very quickly, first of all, hormonal dysregulation. I'm just going to say that it affects a lot of different symptoms, and a lot of systems, a lot of symptoms. So think PMS symptoms, think perimenopausal symptoms. Yeah, without going through the detail. So what are the risk factors for hormonal dysregulation? Chronic stress, HPA axis dysfunction. Again, we'll come to that. Inflammation, insulin resistance, so blood sugar, thyroid imbalances, and environmental endocrine disruptors. So in short, plastics and compounds that they put in our cleaning products, in our cosmetics that have the molecular shape that mimics estrogen, and so it can bind onto the estrogen receptor and mess everything up. And with thyroid, I just want to also say that the symptoms of thyroid, hyperthyroidism, they really often mimic hormonal system symptoms. So sometimes they can affect each other, but they can also mimic each other. Okay, lab testing. These are just the different, estrogen and progesterone. I've asterisked it because yes, you can test them by blood, but again, they're better tested by urine. Testosterone, you want to look at free and total, and that is by blood. Sex hormone binding globulin, LH, FSH. So sex hormone binding globulin is going to tell you how much sex hormone is bound or available. And it helps to interpret the free hormone levels, especially testosterone, estradiol. LH and FSH, this is going to reflect ovarian responsiveness and menopausal status. But if you have high levels, it's going to say that it's going to suggest that there's reduced ovarian activity, as in peri or menopause. And if you have a high LH to FSH ratio, this can be a clue for polycystic ovarian syndrome. And then also histamine, B12, folate, B6. So histamine methylation cycle. Then dried urine. This is the Dutch test. It's an acronym for dried urine something hormones. And this is really the gold standard for testing hormones, especially estrogen, progesterone. And it's going to look at, in particular, how is your body eliminating estrogen, which is important because estrogen works her magic when she's bound to the receptor. And when she's not bound, she's floating around, and you really want her out of the house because she's toxic when she's just floating around. And this test, it's not available by doctors. It's something a functional medicine practitioner can order for you, but unfortunately, it's not covered by insurance. Okay, so how do hormones relate to neurodivergence? Well, hormonal shifts can absolutely intensify neurodivergent traits. So think what happened in puberty, our menstrual cycles, what happens in perimenopause, what happens in menopause. And the first three of these are really about hormone fluctuations. And in menopause, then it's about low levels. And this is because estrogen and progesterone, they really they affect dopamine, GABA. So dopamine for attention, motivation. GABA is really calming. And serotonin is the so-called happy neurotransmitter. But again, all of these are gross oversimplifications. But all of these neurotransmitters, neuromodulators are key in neurodivergent neurobiology. So I'll just give a little quiz. And the quiz would be, the question is, why does ADHD diagnosis peak in perimenopause? This is what I did my master's thesis on. I can't see the chat, and I can't actually see all of you. So I'm just going to answer the quiz, which is because dopamine loves estrogen. It's another love story. It's like histamine and estrogen, dopamine and estrogen. So when estrogen is doing this, dopamine is doing this, right? And then when estrogen does this, dopamine does this. So I think it explains a lot about neurodivergence diagnosis peaking in perimenopause. And then also, being a common theme in menopause. Okay, supporting hormones. I'm just going to say I'm going to leave these for now. And by the way, I haven't shared the slides because I finished them 2 minutes before the presentation because I'm also neurodivergent. But I will be happy to send these to you if you will send me an email, or we can figure that out at the end, but I'm happy to send these to you. So just for the sake of time, our second dysregulation is adrenal gland HPA axis. So HPA being hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenals. Adrenals are just sitting above our kidneys. And this is, again, the slower stress response. So we have fight or flight as part of the nervous system. And then HPA axis is really about cortisol and that slower response. So when we have a dysfunction in the HPA axis, this is how it appears. In the nervous system, anxiety, hypervigilance, poor tolerance to stress, endocrine or hormonal systems. Basically, it's a flattened cortisol rhythm. And I'll just say on that, well, I'll say it by the end, sleep and circadian rhythm. Yeah, it's difficult to get out of bed in the morning. It affects our quality of our sleep, and it makes us, even when we sleep, it's not refreshing. Metabolically, there's a huge correlation between blood sugar and cortisol. Basically, when blood sugar spikes, afterwards, what goes up comes down. And when blood sugar crashes, the brain freaks out because it cannot be without glucose for any amount of time whatsoever. So it rings the bell to the stress response and says, cortisol, go get me some sugar. It's also why we have sugar cravings when our blood sugar drops and when we're stressed. Then in the immune system, we're more susceptible to infections, provokes inflammation. And in the digestive system, I mean, we all know when we have stress that our belly just gets all upset. So that's the link there. And I just want to say on this point, you know, burnout is what happens ultimately with HPA axis dysregulation, meaning that the adrenals have been pumping out cortisol for so long that after a while they just can't do it anymore. It's what used to be called adrenal fatigue, and that definition or that terminology has gone out of favor because it's not about fatigue per se. It's about a signaling. It's not that the adrenals can't produce cortisol. It's that the signaling becomes dysregulated. So when we talk about burnout, we tend to think of it as, you know, it's just mental, it's just too much in my head, and finally it just cracks. But in reality, it's a physiological occurrence. It might have a lot of mental drivers for sure, but it's physiological in that it is a flat line of cortisol. It's that, again, the signaling no longer works, and you literally don't have enough cortisol to get out of bed. So that's how burnout fits into this. Risk factors for HPA axis dysregulation, also burnout. Okay, chronic stress. If you have a history of burnout, trauma, poor sleep, if you already have unstable blood sugar, yeah, inflammation, infection, estrogen dominance, again, high estrogen compared to progesterone. Then you can test these by blood. However, cortisol is best tested by saliva. It's because on a blood test, you get, you're looking at cortisol in one moment of time. But cortisol is meant to have a daily rhythm. So when you look at it with a 24-hour cortisol test, you really can see how it rises and falls and compared to how it should rise and fall. How does this relate to neurodivergent? Well, first of all, we've all been in burnout, I'm sure. Many of us live in a state of chronic stress, hyperarousal, because of sensory overload, because of masking, because of trauma, and the list goes on and on. And all of this affects then our cortisol patterns and autonomic tone, meaning our nervous system. And again, you'll have these in your slides should you ask for those. Then finally, and then I'm going to stop talking and listen to your questions. Mitochondria. Again, mitochondria is the part of the cell that produces energy. So just very briefly, this is how you can test mitochondria. The best way of testing it is the organic acids test. And this is really looking at the metabolic compounds that formulate from mitochondria. Okay, this is how it shows up in the body. Okay, I think we probably know how low energy appears in the body. I mean, mitochondrial dysfunction is all about low energy. So fatigue, you're exhausted after doing any kind of movement, muscle weakness, slow recovery, intolerance to exercise. In the nervous system and in the brain, it can show up as brain fog, inattention, sensory sensitivity, ringing any bells. I'm sure you're out there ticking your boxes. Yeah, just gonna whiz through. Again, supporting mitochondria, you'll have this in your slides. And with that, I'm going to stop talking. We're going to stop the recording, and I want to listen to your questions. So let me stop sharing my screen. And thank you for